A storm brews behind sterile walls. The air in the maternity ward was thick with anticipation, punctuated by the occasional muffled cry of a newborn from a nearby room. The sterile light reflected off the polished floors, casting a cold, clinical ambience over what should have been the warmest day of Jackie and David's lives. Jackie shifted in the padded chair beside the hospital bed, her swollen belly leading her every movement. She winced as another contraction tightened her abdomen like a vice, stealing her breath momentarily. David, her husband, stood by the window, one hand resting on the sill while the other adjusted his tie, a nervous habit she'd grown to love. He was an impressive man, tall, poised, and confident, the embodiment of leadership. As the chief operating officer of this very hospital, David had spent countless hours ensuring the smooth functioning of the facility, making it one of the most respected in the state. Today, however, he wasn't the COO. Today, he was just a husband on the verge of becoming a father. "You doing okay, babe?" he asked, turning to face her. His voice was soft, but his brow furrowed with worry. Jackie nodded, brushing a strand of curly hair from her damp forehead. "I'm okay. Just ready for her to be here. These contractions are getting serious, though." David moved to her side, crouching to meet her eyes. "You're the strongest person I know," he said, his hand finding hers. He squeezed gently. "We've been through so much to get here. Just a little while longer." She smiled, despite the pain. "We have, haven't we?" The memories of their journey washed over her in a flash. Years of trying, countless doctor's visits, and heartbreak after heartbreak. When the IVF finally worked, it had felt like a miracle. And now, here they were, on the brink of welcoming their long-awaited daughter into the world. A sharp knock at the door interrupted the moment. Jackie's smile faded as the door swung open, revealing a nurse in crisp blue scrubs. Her blonde hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her expression was as cold as the fluorescent lighting. Her name tag read Nancy. "Good morning," Nancy said, her tone brisk and businesslike. "I'm your nurse for today." "Hi," Jackie replied, forcing a polite smile despite the way Nancy's detached demeanor rubbed her the wrong way. Nancy barely acknowledged her. She stepped forward, clipboard in hand, and began rattling off questions without waiting for answers. "How long have you been having contractions?" "First pregnancy, right? Let's see how far along you are." Jackie nodded, gripping the armrest as another contraction built. "Yes, first pregnancy. The contractions started early this morning." Nancy interrupted, glancing at her watch, typical for a first-time mom. "The pain always seems worse than it is. Let's get you settled." David straightened, his eyes narrowing slightly at the dismissive comment. Jackie caught the look and gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. She didn't want a confrontation. Not now, not here. Nancy adjusted the hospital bed with a few swift movements, barely looking at Jackie as she worked. "It's too early for an epidural, so just focus on breathing through the contractions. I'll be back to check on you in a bit." Without waiting for a response, she scribbled something on her clipboard and left the room, the door clicking shut behind her. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken tension. Jackie leaned back against the pillows, her breathing shallow as another contraction took hold. "Maybe she's just having a bad day," she said, more to herself than to David. David's jaw tightened. Bad day or not, she could at least pretend to care. Jackie managed a weak laugh. "You're protective, you know that." "Of course I am," he replied, sitting on the edge of the bed. "You're my wife, and that's our daughter you're bringing into the world." She reached out, resting a hand on his cheek. "I'll be okay. We'll be okay." But deep down, Jackie wasn't sure. Nancy's dismissive tone had planted a seed of doubt in her mind. She had heard the stories, countless stories, of women, especially black women, whose concerns were ignored during labor. Women who had suffered because they weren't taken seriously. Jackie pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the rhythmic in and out of her breathing. She reminded herself that this was David's hospital. If anything went wrong, surely he would make sure she was taken care of. The contractions continued to intensify as the hours ticked by. Jackie gripped the bed rails, her knuckles white, as the pain radiated through her back and abdomen. Each wave was sharper than the last, building to a crescendo that left her gasping for air. David hovered by her side, his worry growing with each passing moment. "I'm going to call Nancy back," he said finally. Jackie shook her head. She said, "It's normal. I don't want to be that patient who complains too much." "You're not complaining," he said firmly. "You're in pain. There's a difference." Before she could protest, he was already at the door, stepping into the hallway to find the nurse. Nancy returned a few minutes later, her expression one of thinly veiled annoyance. "I just checked on you," she said, her tone clipped. "What seems to be the problem now?" "My wife's in a lot of pain," David said, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "We'd like someone to check how far along she is." Nancy sighed as though the request was an enormous inconvenience. First-time moms often think the pain is worse than it really is. "She's probably only a few centimeters dilated. I'll check, but don't expect much." Jackie bit her lip, her face flushed with embarrassment. David's hand tightened on hers, silently offering his support. The examination was quick, and Nancy's expression remained unchanged as she removed her gloves. 3 centimeters, she said, as though confirming a mundane fact. "You've got a long way to go. Try to relax." Relax. Jackie wanted to scream. How was she supposed to relax when her body felt like it was being torn apart? Nancy left the room again, and Jackie turned to David, tears brimming in her eyes. "Something doesn't feel right," she whispered. David placed a hand on her forehead, his palm cool against her fevered skin. "I'm going to make sure they take you seriously," he said. Jackie nodded, her grip on his hand tightening as another contraction hit, this one more excruciating than the last. She closed her eyes, focusing on the sound of David's voice, the steady rhythm of his reassurances. But in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered what she had been trying so hard to ignore. Something was wrong, and no one was listening. The cracks began to show. The clock on the wall ticked softly, a reminder of time that seemed to drag and race simultaneously. For Jackie, every minute felt like an eternity, a battle between her body and the waves of pain that surged through her. Each contraction was worse than the last, and the little reprieve in between was shrinking. She squeezed her eyes shut, gripping the bed rails so tightly her nails left crescent-shaped imprints in her palms. David paced the room, his polished shoes clicking against the linoleum floor. Normally, his presence brought her comfort, his calm demeanor a steadying force. But today, she could feel the unease radiating off him like heat waves. He checked his watch for what must have been the 10th time in 5 minutes, then glanced toward the door, willing it to open. "She's taking too long," he muttered, more to himself than to Jackie. "I told her something's not right." Jackie opened her eyes, her gaze finding his. She wanted to tell him to calm down, to sit with her, but she couldn't find the words. The pain had taken over, leaving her too weak to do anything but breathe. David stopped pacing and moved to her side, brushing a damp curl away from her forehead. "You're burning up," he said, his brow furrowing. "That's it. I'm getting someone else." "No," Jackie whispered, her voice hoarse. "She'll come back. Just wait." David hesitated, his jaw tightening as he looked at her. "Jackie, you're in pain. This isn't normal." "I know it's not." Jackie tried to smile, though it came out as more of a grimace. "First time, Mom, remember. I'm probably just overreacting." But even as she said it, doubt gnawed at the edges of her mind. The pain wasn't just bad. It was unbearable, a sharp, unrelenting force that made her entire body tense. She had read all the books, attended all the classes, and nothing had prepared her for this. Before David could argue further, the door swung open, and Nancy strode in, clipboard in hand. She glanced at Jackie, then at the monitors, her expression as impassive as ever. Still 3 centimeters, Nancy announced, as though Jackie were a student failing to meet expectations. It's going to be a long labor. Try to relax and save your energy. Relax. David's voice cut through the room like a whip. He straightened, his usual composed demeanor cracking. She's sweating, shaking, and saying something feels wrong. That doesn't sound like relaxing to me. Nancy barely flinched, her cool professionalism intact. It's normal for labor to intensify as it progresses. If we intervene too early, it can stall labor and make things harder for her in the long run. Jackie wanted to defend herself, to tell Nancy that this wasn't just intense, it was terrifying. But the words caught in her throat as another contraction hit, leaving her gasping for air. David's hand was on her shoulder, steady and reassuring. "Jackie, do you want me to call someone else? Another nurse or a doctor?" She nodded weakly, unable to speak through the pain. Nancy sighed, her irritation now evident. "You can't just call for the doctor every time you feel uncomfortable. He's in surgery right now. Trust me, I've seen hundreds of labors. This is normal." "Normal?" David snapped, his voice rising. "If this is normal, then why does she look like she's about to pass out? Why is she burning up? And why are her contractions so close together already?" Nancy's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because it's labor. It's not supposed to be comfortable." David stepped closer, his height and presence suddenly imposing. "Comfortable isn't the issue. The issue is you're ignoring her concerns. If you don't take action now, you'll be answering to me. And not as her husband." Jackie saw the flicker of confusion on Nancy's face, a brief moment of uncertainty. It was clear she didn't realize who David was, not just another worried husband, but the man who practically ran this hospital. Before Nancy could respond, another contraction ripped through Jackie, and she let out a strangled cry, her body arching off the bed. "Something's wrong." Jackie gasped, tears streaming down her face. "Please, listen to me." The urgency in her voice finally seemed to cut through Nancy's composure. She set the clipboard aside and began adjusting the monitors, her movements quick and methodical. "I'll check again," she said, snapping on a pair of gloves. David moved to the other side of the bed, taking Jackie's hand in both of his. "Breathe, babe," he murmured. "Just breathe. I'm here." Nancy's examination was brief, but when she straightened, her expression had shifted. For the first time, there was a hint of concern in her eyes. "You're still not progressing," she said, her tone quieter now. "But your baby's heart rate is a little elevated. I'll call the doctor and see if he can step in when he's out of surgery." David's grip on Jackie's hand tightened. "Call him now," he said firmly. Nancy hesitated, her gaze flickering between the monitors and David. Then she nodded, leaving the room without another word. As soon as the door closed, Jackie let out a shaky breath. "David," she whispered, "I'm scared." He leaned closer, pressing his forehead to hers. "I know, baby. I know. But I won't let anything happen to you or our little girl. I promise." The minutes stretched on endlessly, the silence broken only by the rhythmic beeping of the monitors. Jackie's contractions grew closer together, each one more unbearable than the last. When the door finally opened again, it wasn't Nancy, but another nurse. A younger woman with kind eyes and a quick, efficient demeanor. She introduced herself as Clara and immediately began checking Jackie's vitals. "You're running a fever," Clara said, her voice calm but urgent. "And your blood pressure is dropping. I'm calling for an emergency consult." Jackie felt a surge of relief at the nurse's words. Someone was finally listening. As Clara worked, Nancy reappeared in the doorway, her arms crossed and her expression tight. "I've got this," she said sharply. "No, you don't," David said, his voice like steel. "You've had hours, and she's only gotten worse. Either you help or you get out of the way." Nancy glared at him, but said nothing, stepping aside as Clara continued her work. Minutes later, the doctor arrived, still wearing his surgical scrubs. His face was serious as he assessed the situation, his hands moving swiftly as he examined Jackie and the monitors. "We're prepping for an emergency C-section," he announced, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jackie felt a wave of both fear and relief. She didn't know what would happen next, but at least someone was finally taking charge. As the medical team prepared to move her, Jackie looked up at David, her vision blurred with tears. "Stay with me," she whispered. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised, his voice steadied despite the fear in his eyes. And as they wheeled her out of the room, Jackie clung to that promise, hoping it would be enough to carry her through what was to come. In the shadow of the operating room, the corridor outside the operating room was a blur of activity. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air as Jackie was wheeled toward the surgical suite, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She could hear the rapid exchange of medical jargon between the nurses and Dr. Sullivan, the lead obstetrician, but it felt distant, like voices heard through water. David was by her side, walking in stride with the gurney. His normally composed face was etched with worry, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck stood out. He reached down, grabbing Jackie's hand as they approached the double doors of the operating room. "I'll be right here," he said, his voice cracking ever so slightly. "You're going to be okay. Our little girl is going to be okay." Jackie nodded weakly, her fingers gripping his as tightly as she could manage. The contractions had become a dull roar in the background, overshadowed by a new sensation, an overwhelming heaviness in her lower abdomen that made her feel as if her body was on the verge of giving out. The doors swung open, and Jackie was wheeled into the brightly lit operating room. David stopped at the threshold, barred from entering further. A nurse handed him a set of scrubs and gestured for him to wait in the preparation area. "I need to be in there with her," David said, his voice rising slightly. Dr. Sullivan turned briefly, his expression firm. "We'll bring you in as soon as she's prepped, but right now we need space to move quickly. I'll make sure she's okay." David nodded reluctantly, stepping back as the doors swung shut. Left alone in the prep area, he paced back and forth, the sterile scrubs crumpled in his hands. His mind raced, replaying the events of the day in agonizing detail. How had it come to this? He had built his career on ensuring that this hospital was a sanctuary of care and excellence. And yet, his wife had been ignored, dismissed, and left to suffer until it was almost too late. His fists clenched at the thought of Nancy. Her cold indifference and refusal to listen to Jackie's concerns had nearly cost them everything. He would deal with her later, he promised himself. Right now, his focus had to be on Jackie and their unborn daughter. In the operating room, Jackie lay on the table, her body trembling despite the warm blankets draped over her. The room buzzed with activity as the medical team worked to prepare her for the emergency C-section. "Jackie," Dr. Sullivan said, leaning down so that his face was level with hers, "we're going to deliver your baby now. I need you to stay as calm as you can. You're in good hands." Jackie nodded, though her heart was pounding so loudly she could barely hear him. She felt the cool swipe of antiseptic on her belly, followed by the slight pinch of the anesthetic being administered. As the medication began to take effect, her mind drifted to David. She wished he were here, holding her hand, telling her everything was going to be okay. She felt a wave of guilt for doubting him earlier. He had been her rock through everything, through years of infertility, through the emotional toll of IVF, and now through this. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the doctor's voice. "We're ready to begin." The next few minutes felt like an eternity. Jackie could feel the pressure and tugging as the doctors worked, though the pain was mercifully dulled by the anesthesia. She stared up at the bright surgical lights, her breaths coming in shallow gasps as she waited for the moment she had dreamed of for so long. Suddenly, there was a cry, a high-pitched, beautiful cry that filled the room like music. "She's here," one of the nurses exclaimed. Jackie felt a surge of emotion so overwhelming that tears streamed down her face. She craned her neck, desperate to catch a glimpse of her daughter. A nurse brought the baby over, carefully swaddled in a warm blanket. "Here she is, Mom," the nurse said, her voice soft. Jackie reached out, her trembling hand brushing against the baby's cheek. Her daughter was tiny, with a head full of dark curls and lungs strong enough to make her presence known. Jackie laughed through her tears, overwhelmed by the sheer miracle of it. "David," she whispered, "David needs to see her." The nurse smiled. "We'll bring him in soon. Let's make sure you're both stable first." As the team continued their work, ensuring Jackie's vitals were stable and completing the procedure, the nurse carried the baby to the warmer for a quick check. Jackie watched through tear-filled eyes, her heart swelling with love and relief. Back in the prep area, David was still pacing when the doors finally opened, and a nurse stepped out. "Mr. Carter," she said. David turned, his heart leaping into his throat. "Is she okay? Is the baby okay?" "They're both doing well," the nurse said, smiling. "Your wife's stable, and your daughter is healthy. Would you like to meet her?" David didn't wait for an answer. He followed the nurse into the room, his hands shaking with a mixture of relief and anticipation. When he entered, his eyes immediately found Jackie. She was pale and tired, but the glow on her face was unmistakable. Cradled in her arms was their daughter, her tiny face peeking out from the blanket. "David," Jackie said, her voice barely above a whisper. He rushed to her side, his eyes brimming with tears as he looked down at their baby. "She's perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Jackie nodded, her smile radiant, despite her exhaustion. "She's ours." David leaned down, pressing a kiss to Jackie's forehead and then to his daughter's tiny head. For a moment, the chaos and fear of the day faded away, replaced by a sense of peace and gratitude. But as he held his family close, a steely resolve settled over him. This wasn't over. Nancy's negligence had nearly cost them everything, and he wouldn't let it slide. Not for Jackie, not for his daughter, and not for the countless other patients who might suffer if she continued to work unchecked. For now, though, he focused on the miracle before him, vowing to protect them both with everything he had. A reckoning in the hallways. The soft cries of their newborn daughter echoed faintly in the recovery room. Jackie, propped up on pillows, cradled her baby close to her chest, her fingers tracing the delicate curve of the tiny face she had waited so long to see. Despite her exhaustion, a smile lingered on her lips, a fragile expression of relief and gratitude. David sat beside her, one hand resting on the bed and the other brushing over their daughter's small hand. The baby's fingers curled around his pinky, and the simple gesture broke the dam of emotions he had been holding back. Tears slid down his cheeks, silent and unchecked. "She's strong," Jackie murmured, her voice still hoarse. "She gets that from you," David replied, his voice trembling. Jackie laughed softly, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at her tender abdomen. David immediately reached for her hand, his protective instincts kicking in. "Are you okay? Do you need anything?" he asked, his tone laced with concern. "I'm okay," Jackie said, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of lingering fear. She hesitated, glancing down at her daughter. "I just keep thinking about what could have happened." David's jaw tightened, his gaze hardening. "It shouldn't have come to that," he said, his voice low but firm. "I trusted this place, this team, to take care of you. And they didn't." Jackie nodded, her eyes welling with tears. "If you hadn't been here, if you hadn't pushed them to listen, I don't know what would have happened." David's grip on her hand tightened. "They'll listen now," he said, a determined edge to his voice. The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted their moment. A nurse entered the room, her expression warm as she checked Jackie's vitals and glanced at the baby. "She's perfect," the nurse said, smiling. "And you're recovering well. The doctor will be in soon to check on you both." David nodded, though his mind was already elsewhere. As soon as the nurse left, he leaned over and kissed Jackie's forehead. "I'll be back," he said. "Where are you going?" Jackie asked, her brow furrowing. "To make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else," David replied. The administrative wing of the hospital was eerily quiet, the hum of fluorescent lights the only sound as David strode down the hallway. He wasn't in his usual business attire. His tie was gone, and his shirt was wrinkled from hours of worry and pacing, but his presence was as commanding as ever. When he reached the office of the chief medical officer, Dr. Langston, he didn't bother to knock. He pushed the door open, startling the older man who sat behind a large mahogany desk. "David," Dr. Langston said, rising to his feet, "I heard about Jackie and the baby. Congratulations." "This isn't about congratulations," David interrupted, his tone cold. "It's about the negligence that almost cost me my family." Dr. Langston's smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "What happened?" David stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "Nancy, that's what happened. My wife was in active labor, in distress, and that nurse dismissed her concerns at every turn. If Dr. Sullivan hadn't acted when he did, I might have lost both Jackie and my daughter." Dr. Langston sank back into his chair, his expression grim. "David, I'm so sorry. I'll look into it." "You'll do more than look into it," David said, cutting him off. "This isn't the first time I've heard complaints about Nancy. Patients have filed reports, staff have raised concerns, and yet she's still here. Why?" Dr. Langston hesitated, his hands folded in front of him. "Nancy has been with us for a long time. She's experienced at ignoring patients," David snapped. "Experienced at brushing off their pain because she thinks she knows better. That's not the kind of experience this hospital needs." Dr. Langston sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You're right. I've been lenient because of her tenure, but that was a mistake. I'll take disciplinary action immediately." David shook his head. "That's not enough. She shouldn't be here at all, not after what she's done. If you won't terminate her, I will." Dr. Langston met David's gaze, the weight of the situation sinking in. "I'll handle it," he said finally. "You have my word." David nodded, though his jaw remained tight. "Good. Because if I find out she's still putting patients at risk, there will be consequences for her and for this hospital." Nancy was on her lunch break when the call came. She had just settled into the staff lounge with her coffee when her supervisor approached, clipboard in hand and a grave expression on her face. "Nancy," the supervisor said, "we need to talk." Nancy frowned, setting her coffee aside. "What's this about?" The supervisor gestured toward the door. "Let's step into my office." Back in the recovery room, Jackie was dozing lightly when David returned. He walked over to her bedside, his expression softer now, but no less resolved. "Did you do it?" Jackie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David nodded. "It's handled. She won't hurt anyone else." Jackie closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Thank you." David leaned down, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I told you, I'll always protect you." He glanced down at their daughter, who was now sleeping soundly in Jackie's arms. For the first time since the ordeal began, he allowed himself to exhale, the weight of the day lifting slightly. But as he watched his wife and daughter, a new determination took root. This wasn't just about his family anymore. It was about every patient who walked through the doors of this hospital. They deserved to be heard, to be cared for, to be treated with dignity and respect. And as long as he was in charge, he would make sure that happened. Voices that must be heard. The hospital lobby was unusually quiet for the early evening, the day's chaos winding down as visiting hours ended. David sat in his corner office, the blinds half drawn to block out the glare of the setting sun. His desk, typically immaculate, was now cluttered with reports and memos, all of them related to Nancy. For hours, he had pored over records, patient complaints, and staff evaluations. The deeper he delved, the clearer it became that Jackie's ordeal wasn't an isolated incident. Nancy's history was littered with similar accounts. Dismissive behavior, patients feeling neglected, and delays in critical care. Yet for years, these red flags have been buried under excuses and bureaucratic red tape. David clenched his jaw as he read through yet another complaint, this one from a young mother whose concerns during labor were similarly dismissed. The words on the page blurred as his anger bubbled to the surface. How had this been allowed to continue? A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Dr. Langston entered, his expression weary. He carried a thick folder under one arm and a cup of coffee in the other. "I've reviewed everything," Langston said, placing the folder on David's desk. "You were right. Nancy should have been removed years ago. I take full responsibility for this." David leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Responsibility isn't enough, Langston. Lives were put at risk. This isn't just about firing her. It's about rebuilding trust with our patients." Langston nodded. "I've already started the process. She's on administrative leave effective immediately, pending a full review. But I think we both know what the outcome will be." David exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Good. But this isn't just about her. We need to take a hard look at how complaints are handled here. It's clear the system failed, and it's on us to fix it." Langston sipped his coffee, his expression thoughtful. "What are you proposing?" David stood, pacing the room as he spoke. "We create a new system, one that ensures patient voices are heard. A dedicated committee to review complaints in real time, composed of medical staff and patient advocates. No more letting things slip through the cracks." Langston raised an eyebrow. "That's a big undertaking." "It's necessary," David said firmly. "We owe it to the people who trust us with their lives, and I'll personally oversee it." Langston studied him for a moment before nodding. "I'll back you. Let's make it happen." Later that evening, David returned to Jackie's room. The soft glow of a bedside lamp illuminated the scene. Jackie reclining in bed, their newborn daughter nestled against her chest. David paused in the doorway, the sight grounding him in a way nothing else could. For all the chaos and pain of the past 24 hours, this moment made it worth it. Jackie looked up as he entered, a tired but genuine smile spreading across her face. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey," he replied, crossing the room to sit beside her. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice tinged with both curiosity and concern. "It's a start," David said, reaching out to gently stroke their daughter's head. "Nancy's on leave, and Langston's backing me on creating a new system for patient advocacy. It's not perfect, but it's progress." Jackie nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you for fighting for us, and for everyone else who comes here." David took her hand in his, squeezing gently. "I made a promise. To you and to her," he said, glancing at their daughter. "I'm not going to let anyone else go through what you did." The next morning, Jackie was feeling stronger, the color returning to her cheeks as she held her daughter. David sat by her side, a laptop balanced on his knees as he drafted the initial framework for the Patient Advocacy Committee. Their quiet moment was interrupted by a knock on the door. Clara, the nurse who had stepped in to help during Jackie's labor, entered with a clipboard. "Good morning," Clara said with a smile. "I just wanted to check in and see how you're both doing." Jackie smiled warmly. "Much better, thanks to you." Clara's cheeks flushed slightly. "I was just doing my job." "No," Jackie said, her voice firm. "You went above and beyond. You listened to me when no one else would. I can't thank you enough for that." David stood, extending a hand to Clara. "You were exactly what Jackie needed in that moment. And because of you, we're making changes to ensure every patient gets that same level of care." Clara shook his hand, her expression turning serious. "I'm glad to hear that. Patients deserve to feel safe and heard, especially during such vulnerable moments." David nodded. "And they will, thanks to people like you." The following weeks brought a whirlwind of change. Under David's leadership, the hospital began implementing the new patient advocacy system. A hotline was established, staffed 24/7 by trained professionals ready to address concerns in real time. A diverse committee was formed, including doctors, nurses, and former patients, to ensure every voice was represented. Nancy's departure was finalized, her tenure at the hospital coming to an unceremonious end. While some staff defended her, many privately admitted that her dismissal was long overdue. Jackie, meanwhile, became a quiet force in the background. She spoke with David often about her experience, offering insights and suggestions for how the system could better serve patients like her. Her story became a rallying cry within the hospital, a reminder of why these changes were necessary. One evening, weeks after the ordeal, David returned home to find Jackie sitting in the nursery, rocking their daughter to sleep. The room was bathed in the soft glow of a nightlight, the gentle hum of a lullaby filling the air. "She's out like a light," Jackie said with a smile, glancing up at David. He stepped forward, leaning against the doorway. "You're amazing, you know that." Jackie laughed softly. "I think we've both had to be pretty strong lately." David crossed the room, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Because of you, things are changing. Patients will be safer, better cared for. That's your legacy." Jackie looked down at their sleeping daughter, her expression tender. "No," she said, "that's hers. We did this for her, and for every other child who deserves to grow up with a mom who makes it through labor." David nodded, his heart swelling with pride and love. Together, they had weathered the storm, and now they were building something better, not just for their family, but for countless others. As he wrapped his arms around Jackie and their daughter, he felt a deep sense of peace. They had fought for what mattered, and they had won. A new legacy begins. The sun shone brightly through the nursery window as Jackie adjusted the small blanket over her daughter, whose tiny chest rose and fell in a rhythm that never failed to soothe her heart. It had been 6 weeks since the harrowing day of her birth, 6 weeks of recovery and growth, not just for Jackie but for their entire family. David stood at the door, leaning against the frame, watching quietly. His face, usually defined by a commanding confidence, softened as he took in the scene. He had spent the better part of the past month balancing his roles as husband and father, and though he was exhausted, the sight of Jackie and their daughter made it all worthwhile. "How are my 2 favorite girls?" he asked, stepping into the room. Jackie looked up, her smile radiant despite the faint shadows of sleepless nights under her eyes. "She's perfect," she said, her voice soft. "Every time I look at her, I'm reminded of how lucky we are." David crouched down beside the rocking chair, resting a hand on Jackie's knee. "We're not just lucky," he said firmly. "We fought for this, for her, for us, for every family who walks through those hospital doors." Jackie nodded, her gaze falling to their daughter. "I know, and I want to keep fighting. I've been thinking, maybe there's more I can do." David tilted his head, intrigued. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath, as if summoning the courage to speak the idea that had been brewing in her mind. "I want to share my story, not just with you or the hospital, but with others who've experienced the same fear, the same dismissal. If my story can help even one person feel empowered to speak up, it'll be worth it." David's eyes softened, a mixture of pride and admiration shining through. "You'd be incredible at that," he said. "Your voice matters, Jackie, and if you want to make a difference, I'll support you every step of the way." 2 months later, Jackie stood on a small stage in the hospital's newly renovated auditorium. The seats were filled with staff, patients, and community members who had come to hear the first installment of the hospital's new series, Stories That Heal. It was a program Jackie had helped David create, designed to give patients and their families a platform to share their experiences and advocate for change. As Jackie stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. She glanced at David, seated in the front row with their daughter cradled in his arms, and the sight gave her strength. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in her chest. "My name is Jackie Carter, and I want to share a story with you, a story about fear, resilience, and ultimately, hope." She spoke about her pregnancy, the joy and anticipation that had defined those months, And the moment it all began to unravel, she recounted the pain, the fear, and the frustration of being dismissed by someone who was supposed to care for her. She described the moment she thought she might lose everything, and the relief that came when someone finally listened. But she didn't stop there. She spoke about the systemic issues that had allowed such negligence to persist, the biases and blind spots that too often left women, especially Black women, vulnerable during childbirth. She shared statistics and stories, weaving her personal experience into a larger narrative about the need for accountability and change. By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The audience erupted into applause, a standing ovation that left Jackie momentarily overwhelmed. David stood, holding their daughter, his pride evident as he joined in the applause. Jackie met his eyes, and in that moment, she knew they were building something bigger than themselves, a legacy of care, compassion, and courage. The changes at the hospital continued to ripple outward. The Patient Advocacy Committee was officially established, with Jackie serving as an honorary member. Her story became the foundation of new training programs for staff, emphasizing the importance of listening to patients and recognizing the implicit biases that could cloud judgment. Nancy's absence, while initially a point of contention among some staff, eventually became a symbol of the hospital's commitment to excellence. Her departure signaled a shift, a refusal to tolerate mediocrity when lives were at stake. Clara, the nurse who had intervened during Jackie's labor, was promoted to lead a new task force on patient care standards. She and Jackie worked closely together, brainstorming ways to ensure that every patient felt heard and valued. One day, as Jackie strolled through the hospital lobby with her daughter in a carrier, she overheard a conversation between two women seated in the waiting area. "I was so nervous about coming here," one woman said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I've heard so many stories about hospitals ignoring people like us." The other woman nodded. "I was nervous too, but you know what? This place is different. They actually listen. My cousin gave birth here last month, and she said the nurses were incredible. She felt safe." Jackie paused, her heart swelling with pride. She turned to Clara, who was walking beside her, and smiled. "It's working," Jackie said quietly. Clara smiled back. "It is, and it's because of you." That evening, Jackie and David sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset as their daughter dozed peacefully in her bassinet. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, a tranquil backdrop to the end of a busy day. "Do you think we're making a difference?" Jackie asked, leaning her head against David's shoulder. David wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "I don't think it. I know it. You're changing lives, Jackie. We both are." She sighed contentedly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "I just want her to grow up in a world where she knows her voice matters, where every voice matters." David kissed the top of her head. "She will, because of you." As the last rays of sunlight faded, Jackie closed her eyes, feeling a deep sense of peace. They had faced the unthinkable and emerged stronger, not just as individuals but as a family. And in the process, they had sparked a movement, one that would continue to grow, fueled by the voices of those who refused to be silenced. The legacy they were building wasn't just about a single hospital or a single family. It was about something much bigger. The belief that everyone deserved to be seen, heard, and cared for. And that, Jackie knew, was only the beginning.